The infirmary at Saitan smelled of blood and burning herbs. 4 beds down the ward sat empty, stripped clean, names removed from the room assignment board. The ones they hadn't brought back. A young man lay on the cot nearest the window. Mage cloth bandaging covered him from shoulder to hip. His chest moved, but only just. His left hand rested flat on the sheets, though it wasn't entirely his hand anymore. A gray horn jutted from his knuckles, fused into the skin as though it had grown there, which in a sense it had. 3 days ago, a half-demon named Samuel had been dying with a ruined arm and a severed leg on a battlefield that shouldn't have existed. He'd made a choice. Now he was a horn, waiting to be rebuilt from the inside out, running on his enemy's mana as fuel. A pink-haired girl sat beside the cot. She hadn't moved in 3 hours. One of the nurses had brought her tea. She'd let it go cold without noticing. The ward staff didn't ask her to leave. They'd tried that once, early on. They hadn't tried again. The young man in the cot was 4 days past emergency surgery and still hadn't opened his eyes. His name inside this world was Adele, heir to the ruined arson bloodline, half-demon. The cadet who had just killed a 5th Circle mage in single combat, survived a fight with one of the Imperial Academy's most dangerous operatives, and dragged 17 of his classmates through a live battlefield with most of their limbs still attached. 4 hadn't made it. Their empty beds held that weight without apologizing for it. What nobody in that ward knew, what nobody in this entire world knew, was that 3 weeks ago, this young man had been a novelist, a human one, living in an apartment on the other side of reality, finishing the last chapter of a dark fantasy series he had spent 5 years writing. He had created every person in this room, designed their histories and their traumas and their reasons for hating each other. He had written Samuel's dead mother and Luna's terror. He had built Renee's grief from scratch and given Fias a secondary protagonist arc that was supposed to be about redemption. He had constructed a world of massacres and war crimes and family bloodlines broken by political fear, and he had called it entertainment. And now he was lying in that world's medical ward with a boy fused to his hand while 4 empty beds waited for families who would never receive good news. 3 weeks earlier, this is how it started. Nam Woo-hyun finished his novel at 12 minutes past midnight. He saved the file. He stretched. He stared at his apartment ceiling for a long while in the particular quiet that follows the end of something large, and then he went to bed satisfied. He woke up to stone overhead instead of plaster. The body he was in ached across the ribs and both legs. Alarming, because his own body had been entirely fine. He sat up and looked at hands that were wrong. Longer fingers, different width, a scar running from the left wrist toward the palm that he hadn't put there. He found the room's only mirror, a cracked piece propped against the far wall, and what looked back at him stopped his breath. He knew that face. He had drawn it on a reference sheet 2 years ago. Sharp jaw, fox-slanted eyes, bone structure that read as both beautiful and dangerous from the same distance. Dark hollows under the eyes from months of deliberate physical degradation. The face of Arsene Adele, the doomed villain of his own novel, the character he had written to fail spectacularly before the story reached its halfway point. A folded paper sat on the desk beside him. He opened it with hands he was still learning were his. Text appeared on the blank surface as he watched, letters forming one by one, as if dictated by something patient that had been waiting a long time. The message was detailed and unhurried. It told him the following. The original Arsene Adele was functionally dying. The body had been systematically weakened over years. Monosuppressors administered through food and water by enemies who couldn't kill him openly, but could ensure he never became a threat. His combat ability was almost nothing. The men assigned to finally eliminate him were 3 hours away, operating under a specific timeline and without intent to negotiate. The original Adele had summoned the novelist deliberately, choosing someone who knew the full shape of the story because no one alive knew it better. The paper's last line was not a request and not a plea. He had written only that he did not want to die a dog's death. That was the arrangement. 3 abilities arrived in the novelist's mind in the following moment. Not learned, but simply present. Like the layout of a house you've lived in so long you navigate it without thinking. Darkness. Killing intent. Position transfer. He had perhaps 2 hours to understand what they felt like in practice. Captain Feltz arrived before dawn with 6 knights in full enchanted armor. Lyon County's cleaner. The The man had honest blue eyes and the methodical calm of someone who had never failed a completed assignment, which made him more dangerous than a cruel man would have been. Cruelty produces ego, and ego produces mistakes. Feltz produced neither. His orders were simple: enter, confirm the kill, return by sunrise. Quiet work, the kind that appeared in no official ledger. The novelist heard boots on the lower stairs and felt cold settle through his chest. He pressed his back flat against the wall beside the bedroom door and focused on what position transfer actually felt like from the inside. A pull, something like a rope attached to whatever object he'd chosen, requiring intent and a measured spend of mana to trigger. The body's mana was almost empty. He would get 3 uses, perhaps 4. After that, the body would simply stop cooperating. The door opened. He didn't wait for the knights to spread out and box him in, which is what trained men do when given adequate space. The moment the first knight stepped through, he swapped his position with the man's drawn sword. The blade appeared in his grip. The knight stumbled forward, clutching air, confused for exactly the 1.5 that confusion lasts before a soldier's reflexes override it. The novelist used those seconds. Across the room, through the window with the pommel, sword set on the outer ledge, himself swapped to it. 2 floors of open air. He hit the ground wrong weight, wrong knees, and came up already running into the dark of the arson forest, with Feltz shouting from the window above. He knew the forest. He had written it. That knowledge was his only genuine advantage. Every path, every dead end, every place where the trees grew dense enough to lose a line of sight. He used all of it for 15 minutes before he accepted that Feltz was running a tighter containment than he'd anticipated. The knights were splitting into coverage arcs, closing off exits in sequence. Without the demonic gate, there was no route out of the region. With it, there was one. The problem was that he had left the gate's exact location vague in the novel. He'd known it existed somewhere in this area, but that area covered a great deal of dark forest at night. He stopped behind the widest oak available, pulled out the information paper, and wrote his question. A price appeared before an answer could. 1 enchanted weapon. He looked at the sword in his hand, still humming with the enchantment the captain had paid good money for. He set it flat against the paper. The blade dissolved. Coordinates appeared. A specific stone formation, a carved marker at the center, 10 minutes northeast. He moved. Feltz came close twice. A thrown log caught him across the shoulder on the second approach. Real pain, not abstract, the kind that shortened the next stride. He filed the information away. This body was fully mortal and wouldn't absorb punishment quietly. He needed to stop absorbing it. The carved stone was exactly where the paper said. The gate shimmered behind it, vertical distortion in the air, taller than a man, the space around it subtly wrong in a way that made the eyes want to slide past. He looked back once. Feltz was 20 yards behind him, close enough that the novelist could see the captain's expression. Professional fury, which is the worst kind. The expression of a man who had never not finished the job. He stepped through the gate. The demon realm smelled of mineral cold and something older than weather. Different trees, longer needles, darker bark. The light had a different quality even at night, as if the sky here processed something it retained in the human world. He stood still for a full minute and just breathed. No pursuit. The gate required demon blood access. Feltz was entirely human and entirely stuck. Whatever came next was a demon problem. Still a severe problem, but at least one he had the notes on. He walked for half an hour before the forest opened into a clearing, with geometry too regular for nature, even spacing, level ground, and at the clearing's far edge a carved gate frame radiating the cold signature of old construction mana. A hidden domain. Human-built, dropped inside demon territory like a trap waiting for the right foot. He'd written about these facilities in the novel's middle arc. Training grounds built by the 6 noble houses, hidden in demon land, designed to catch unsuspecting demon heirs off guard. This one was active. He could feel the mana moving through the frame. There was nowhere else available, so he went in. Stone corridors, old mana lamps. The domain's interior widened as he moved deeper, which was a design choice that meant the hardest encounter was at the back. Undead constructs came in clusters. Old binding magic, no tactical creativity, running in straight lines at whatever moved. He cleared each group by swapping himself to the far end and letting their momentum carry them through the space he'd just vacated. His mana drained with every use. He counted it carefully. By the fourth cluster he had the rhythm. That did not make the fifth one safe. His reserves were thin enough now that a missed swap meant fighting with his hands and a sword he didn't truly know how to use, against things that didn't stop when hit. He moved faster through the remaining corridors. The ceiling vaulted upward in the final chamber. Torches spaced at intervals. A treasure chest against the back wall. At the chamber's center, a Death Knight in full black plate armor, carrying a blade the length of a tall man. The aura it radiated pressed against the room like something solid. The novelist's body registered it as a weight on his sternum, an instruction to step backward built into his nervous system. He had written Death Knights as mid-tier domain guardians, dangerous in a direct fight, manageable if you understood the pattern. He had not written a specific pattern for this one. His mana sat at nearly empty. A single clean hit from that blade would break things that needed to stay unbroken. Killing intent required a mana base to project at range. Running was not an option. The corridor behind him was still full of constructs. He had one move. The night began its challenge declaration. Long, ritual, mandatory, the kind of speech baked into the binding magic that animated it. The novelist listened to 2 sentences. He timed the grip shift, the moment during formal address when a warrior's weapon hand relaxes by habit for emphasis. Halfway through the 3rd sentence, he swapped his position with the sword. The blade appeared in his grip. The Death Knight stood extended, mid-word, gauntlet empty, processing a situation its programming had no prepared response for. Killing intent flooded out of the novelist on instinct, more than he'd intended, more than he knew he had, a wave that bent the air between them and pressed down on the armored figure until one knee touched the stone. He crossed the distance and drove the blade through the gap between the helmet and the gorget. The armor gave. The knight's aura collapsed. He stood there breathing harder than the effort required, because for roughly 45 seconds he had been completely certain he was going to die. The chest at the back wall opened with a heavy click. Black energy rose from it in a slow column and entered him through the eyes, painful at the point of contact, then not. A status window appeared at the edge of his vision. Eye of Superbia. Acquired. He had written it as a rare ocular ability of the Bear bloodline. It read, muscle trajectories instead of weapon paths. Compressed perceived time in critical fractions of a second. He had intended it as Renee's inheritance from this specific domain. He had now taken it. He heard someone else entering the domain behind him. The girl who stepped into the chamber had white hair worn loose and a face that had been set to neutral for so long it no longer felt like a choice. Perhaps 16, no drawn weapon, the mana around her hands barely visible, leashed, not sleeping. She looked at the Death Knight's remains, then at the novelist, then at the borrowed sword in his grip, and said nothing for a moment. He knew exactly who she was. He had written her. Renee of the Bear family, daughter of the Patriarch of Pride, enrolled at Saitan next season to put a blade through every human responsible for her mother's death. She had come to this domain specifically for the Eye of Superbia. It was gone. He was holding the sword that had won it. His mind ran through options at speed and found the list short. He told her he was her assigned bodyguard. Recent hire, cleared through proper channels, dispatched ahead of her arrival to verify the domain's safety. He apologized for the lack of advance notification. Communications from the capital had been delayed. He kept his voice even and his hands still. She studied him for a long moment with those flat gray eyes. The silence was the deliberate kind. Then she said she would verify the assignment with her father upon return, and that he should remain visible until she had done so. He took that as the closest available approximation of mercy and thanked her. Patriarch Kree of the Bear family received them in a hall, with stone pillars and a fire that had been burning long enough to settle deeply into the grate. He was a large man, the kind of size that comes from something older than diet, and he had the unhurried quality of someone who had not needed to rush a single thing in many decades. He asked the novelist 2 questions. He watched the answers more than he listened to the words. Then he explained the implant. A small creature, he said, dormant under normal conditions. It would release a compound into the bloodstream at his instruction if the novelist attempted to leave without permission or act against the family's interests. A standard precaution for personnel whose background resisted full verification. The novelist nodded and accepted it. There was no ground from which to refuse, and Kree's expression didn't suggest the conversation had multiple outcomes. That night, alone in the guest room, He opened his status window and found the creature immediately. A small symbol, labeled Poison Implant, Active. Body location pinpointed in the display. He spent an hour mapping its exact position. Then he focused on position transfer. The radius started at 20 yards. He needed it at millimeters. He wasn't certain that was possible. He tried anyway. What followed was the worst 30 seconds he had experienced in this body. White at the visual edges, the sensation of something moving through tissue that did not want to be moved through. Pain with a very specific interior quality. Then it resolved. The worm sat on his palm and blinked at him. Position transfer leveled up. The status window confirmed it without ceremony. He offered the creature a small amount of mana. It consumed this instantly and completely. It had been living inside a mana-dead environment for however long it had occupied the arson body. It was extremely hungry. He watched it eat from his palm, decided this was a problem to classify later, wrapped it in a cloth from the nightstand, and put it in his coat pocket. Kree noticed none of this. What Kree did notice, over the following days, was that the novelist trained harder than someone faking employment would bother to. That observation earned a second meeting. In that meeting, the patriarch offered something unexpected. The Bear family's personal cultivation technique. A method of mana gathering that bypassed the standard demon practice of drawing ambient energy, and instead received it directly from the demon god. The mana accumulation rate, he said, was substantially superior to anything available through conventional training. The condition was formal registration, standing before the demon god and being judged acceptable for the connection. Kree said this the way someone describes a banking procedure. The novelist said he would do it. He kept his voice steady while he said it. He had written the demon god into the novel as distant mythology, the original source of demonic power, referenced in world-building passages, never an active participant in the current story. He had designed the god as a background fact rather than a character. He had never written what happened when someone actually stood in front of it. He was about to find that out firsthand, inside a world he had built without finishing every room. The altar room beneath the Bear family's mountain was carved into bedrock, not built, the kind of space shaped by something other than tools. Torches here burned a color that didn't have a good name, somewhere between copper and gold, and they did not flicker because there was no wind. The stone floor had markings in a script older than the demon realm's current political arrangements. 4 Bear family elders stood at the perimeter without speaking. Kree stood behind the novelist. Renee was not present, which he suspected was deliberate. He stepped to the center of the room and waited. The god of pride arrived without drama. No light, no sound, no trembling of the earth. The presence simply appeared in the space the way cold fills a room when a window opens. Not a body, not a voice, not a face. Something with weight and attention directed at him, with the patience of something that had never once needed to hurry a judgment. The novelist had nothing useful to offer the moment except honesty about what he was. He stood still and did not flinch, and did not perform. Whatever the god was measuring, he gave it a clean surface to measure. The mark arrived in his chest, like a key fitting a lock. The mark of pride, his own design, now written onto the body he occupied. A moderate power increase under normal conditions, potentially severe under mental collapse. He had written that consequence in as a narrative check, the kind of built-in limitation a careful author uses to keep a protagonist from becoming boring. It had seemed reasonable on the page. It felt considerably less theoretical from the inside. Kree, watching from behind, said something quiet to one of the elders. The novelist heard enough to understand the older man had not been expecting that particular outcome. He filed this away. The cultivation technique followed the next morning, not taught in sessions but transferred through a period of guided meditation, in which Kree held a hand over his student's shoulder, and something passed between them, like warmth going in the wrong direction, outward from him rather than inward. He understood the method afterward, the way you understand a language you've been hearing your whole life but haven't spoken, completely and without being able to explain the understanding. He began practicing immediately. The mana accumulation was not incremental. It was the difference between catching rain in a cup and opening an irrigation channel. Within 3 days, his reserves had reached 3 times the starting point. Within a week, the change was visible to Renee when they crossed paths in the training yard. She stopped mid-step and looked at him and said nothing, which was the closest she generally came to expressing surprise. Renee trained on the eastern side of the mountain. He trained on the western side. After the second week, he noticed she had shifted to the southern ridge, which split the difference, and was doing her forms at a distance where she could hear him work. He did not mention it, neither did she. The arrangement continued. Their conversations happened in the evenings, usually over whatever the household kitchen produced, and they had the stilted quality of two people who disagreed about what the other person was. She had accepted his bodyguard status formally and without enthusiasm. She spoke to him in the clipped registers of a commanding officer who has not yet decided how much basic information to share with subordinate staff. He asked careful questions and listened more than he answered. What he was learning, watching her, was the gap between the character he had written and the person actually present. The character was an instrument, cold, focused, grief converted to purpose. The girl training on the southern ridge was also those things, but the novel had not included the small particular habits. The way she turned a cup in her hands twice before drinking, the way she corrected his sword grip with 2 fingers without stopping her own movement, the way she watched the mountain lion at the end of practice sessions with an expression that had no tactical function. He found he was observing these details in the way an author notes an inconsistency in his own notes, except there was no note to correct. She was not wrong. The notes were. He had written a character with a dead mother, grief weaponized into purpose, and a personality reduced to its most efficient shape. He had not thought about what the evenings would feel like for her. He had not written evenings. He thought about this more than he thought about the cultivation technique. Kree's household had a domain, this one belonging to the bear family rather than the human mages, built in older demon tradition, and structured differently than the one where he'd found Renee. The domain of the undead sat 3 hours into the northern forest, sealed behind a gate that required bear family blood to open. Kree sent them both through on a clear morning, with the specific absence of ceremony that indicated he considered success obligatory. The domain was not subtle about its contents. The first chamber held 12 skeletal soldiers, the second held 30. By the fourth corridor, the numbers required management rather than individual engagement. Too many to dismantle one by one, too spread to clear with any single wide area application of killing intent at his current reserve levels. Renee handled the volume the way a person uses a broom, methodical, efficient, minimal movement, expression unchanged. He handled what reached the outer edges and tried to look as if he'd intended to be positioned there. The necromancer at the domain's center was human-built, a construct, not a living mage, running on ancient binding magic and a soul fragment locked in a crystal at its core. Its raised army numbered somewhere above 40 and coordinated with each other better than random undead should have. It had been active long enough to develop patterns. It took 3 exchanges for the novelist to map them. He placed a darkness void at the construct's left flank. Inside the void he was invisible, his position unknown, his attacks arriving from directions that didn't have geometry the necromancer could track. The dimensional daggers came from the dark like they had no sender, quick releases, precisely aimed at the crystal, not at the surrounding bone and metal. Renee simultaneously drove straight through the necromancer's front line and hit the construct's right side in the same moment the crystal took the third dagger and cracked. The entire army dissolved at once. The silence after was considerable. He sat on a piece of rubble and felt the drain across both shoulders. That particular tired specific to mana debt. The void application was expensive. He needed the cultivation rate to continue compounding before the midterm season. He understood this mathematically, but felt it differently now, sitting in a silent room that had just contained 40 soldiers 30 seconds ago. Renee cleaned her blade on a skeletal forearm and put it away. She looked at the dissolved army and at him, and walked toward the treasure room at the domain's rear. He followed. The chest held 3 items. 2 were marked, family heirlooms, assigned to Renee by the domain's standard logic, a healing artifact, and a defensive ring. He reached the chest second, looked at what remained after she took her 2, and found an unmarked item, a ring set with a stone that caught light wrong, like it was eating the reflection rather than returning it. His status window offered nothing. The information paper quoted a price he didn't have for the full identification. He could tell it was high grade. He could tell it was old. He had not written this specific item. He thought about it for roughly 3 seconds. Renee had treated him well enough, considering she had every reason not to. She had shared training space and corrected his grip and not told her father about several things she probably should have reported. He had nothing to give her that carried weight, and she was about to go back into a world that had killed her mother and would keep trying. He put the ring in her hand and told her he didn't need it. She looked at it. Something crossed her face very briefly. She said she would keep it and put it away and said nothing else for the walk back. He would not learn until significantly later that what he had just done was the demon world equivalent of a formal marriage proposal. The item was called an eternal full moon ring. The cultural weight attached to offering it freely was unambiguous to anyone raised in this realm. Renee was raised in this realm. He was not. The gap between these two facts would become a persistent comedy, except he would not be in on the joke for a long time. Kree summoned them 2 mornings after the domain run. The patriarch stood by the window with a cup he wasn't drinking from, which usually meant he had organized his thoughts and was delivering rather than discussing. He told them both that Saitan's enrollment window opened in 6 days. He told the novelist that he would attend. He said this in the tone of someone announcing a scheduling fact, not offering an opportunity. The novelist registered this, noted that arguing would accomplish nothing, and thought about what Saitan actually meant. He had built it carefully. A demon academy with a reputation built on brutality. Faculty drawn from veteran war commanders. Entrance exams designed to remove applicants rather than select them. A 3-year enrollment period that operated more like a military posting than an education. He had used it as the story's second act setting because academies provide natural escalation structures. Controlled danger, escalating stakes, rival characters forced into proximity. He had thought of it as a stage. He was now scheduled to be a student in it. A student who was technically human, carrying a half-demon bloodline brand that the demon world had collectively decided was sufficient grounds for suspicion, enrolled under a name that belonged to a lineage several noble houses had spent years trying to erase. Kree, as they left the hall, paused and addressed the novelist without turning. He said he hoped the journey went well. Then he wished him good fortune and walked away. He had not said the same thing to his daughter. Renee was 3 steps ahead and had heard both things. He watched her back and said nothing. She didn't slow her pace, but her left hand tightened briefly at her side. A small thing, gone quickly, the kind of thing a person does when they're busy maintaining an expression. He had written that detail into her, years ago, as a physical tell for unexpressed hurt. He hadn't expected to watch it happen with his own eyes in a hallway. The carriage to the capital sat 4. They occupied 2 of the seats with Renee's luggage taking a third. The journey was projected at 2.5 days on demon road surfaces, which ran smoother than the human roads but through terrain that had different ideas about elevation changes. The first day was quiet. Renee spent it reading documents from a locked case. The novelist spent it watching the terrain and cross-referencing his memory of what he'd written about this region's geography with what the actual landscape looked like, which was mostly similar but contained details his narration had skipped. The exact red of the soil at midday, the way the trees here branched in double-forked patterns he'd never specified, the temperature shift between valley and ridge that took roughly 40 minutes to register on the body. His writing had described this world. It had not described being inside it. The second evening, after a rest stop at a way station that smelled of lamp oil and old hay, Renee put her documents away and sat with her hands in her lap and the ring visible on her right hand where she had placed it. He noticed this without manufacturing a reason to mention it. She was looking at the window. She had been processing something since the domain run, and she had not finished processing it, and it was not his to interrupt. He started a sentence about the road conditions. She didn't respond. He finished the sentence anyway, because silence in a small carriage becomes its own kind of pressure, and she looked over at him with an expression that he could not fully read. She said she would be attending Saitan to develop her abilities and execute her purpose, and that his attendance would be useful from a logistical standpoint. He agreed that this seemed practical. She looked at him for one more second with something in her eyes that his novel had not prepared him to name, and then she returned to the window. He found himself thinking about the ring again, but couldn't land on why. The capital was older than anything in the human realm the novelist had written, and noticeably aware of this fact. The architecture did not try to be welcoming. Streets ran at angles that suggested the original planners had prioritized drainage over navigation. The buildings were tall and close and made of stone that had darkened over generations into something closer to charcoal. Demon pedestrians moved through them with the brisk indifference of populations that have been large and organized for a long time. Saitan's registration office sat in a government quarter a mile from the main gate. The receptionist was a woman in institutional gray, with the particular manner of someone whose job involves deciding who is qualified to apply for dangerous things, and who takes this responsibility very seriously. She looked at Adele's application. She looked at his lineage marker. Her expression did not change in any way that constituted a full reaction, but her tone changed considerably when she explained that half-demon applicants from compromised bloodlines were subject to additional verification procedures, and that his enrollment would be processed pending a secondary review, and that he should take a seat. Renee, who had been standing 1 step behind and 2 steps to the left, moved forward. She put her family crest documentation on the desk without rushing the motion or applying any visible force to it. The receptionist looked at it. She looked at Renee. She looked at the documentation again. She processed his enrollment without further comment in approximately 90 seconds and gave him a confirmation slip with the expression of someone who would have preferred a different outcome but understood which outcomes were available. He thanked her without inflection. Renee took back her documentation and they left. Outside, she said nothing about what she'd done. He said nothing about the fact that she'd done it. They walked to the accommodation registration office in the particular companionable silence of two people who have decided not to make something into a moment. Saitan's entrance exam happened on a Tuesday under a sky the color of old pewter. The exam grounds were an open courtyard, enormous, stone-paved, ringed by observation galleries that the faculty occupied. 100 applicants had arrived. They stood in rows of 10 with the spacing of people who were already performing readiness for an audience of evaluators. Some were clearly heirs of major families, the bearing, the quality of the clothes, the way they took up space. Some were barely older than the minimum enrollment age and had the look of people who had recently learned they were being sent somewhere and had not entirely processed the implications. The headmaster arrived last. Lucian was the smallest person in the courtyard. This was always the first thing anyone noticed, and the second thing anyone noticed was that the first observation had been a mistake in some fundamental sense they couldn't immediately articulate. She walked to the center of the exam ground and stood there, and the space rearranged itself around her, in the way spaces do when the highest level entity in the area decides where the center is. She said the first exam would be aura endurance. She said this pleasantly. Then she released hers. What hit the courtyard was not dramatic in the way large forces are usually dramatic. No sound, no wind, no visible phenomenon. It was pressure, the kind that is usually only produced inside the earth, except localized and directed and with intelligence behind it. The first row collapsed within 8 seconds. Not knocked over, simply reaching the point where the biological instruction to remain upright stopped winning against the instruction to stop and lie down. The second row lasted longer. The third and fourth rows fell together in a wave. By the time 40 seconds had passed, 70 of the 100 applicants were on the stone floor. More dropped. 85, 90, 92. 8 people remained standing. 7 of them were the heirs of the 7 deadly sin families. Which made sense. They had been trained specifically for this world and built specifically for this kind of endurance. Their bloodlines a direct inheritance from the origin families. The 8th was the novelist. He was standing because killing intent had activated without a decision, his body reading the aura as a threat and producing a counterpressure automatically, the two forces meeting somewhere in the space between his sternum and the headmaster. He had not chosen to do this. He was reasonably certain it was impolite. He could feel the output of his own ability pressing outward and watch the instructors in the gallery react to it. One hand reaching for a weapon, stopped by a colleague's grip on the wrist, 3 faces shifting into expressions that were combinations of alarm and professional recalculation. Lucian looked at him. Her pressure did not increase. Her expression did not change. But her attention fixed on him with a quality that he recognized as the kind of attention that changes the nature of events thereafter. He held position until she released the field. His knees felt the accumulated cost immediately after. He did not let that show. The exam moved to its second phase. The surviving 8 were organized into teams of 2 and assigned a combat trial. The opponent was a Sword Saint clone, an artificial construct running at partial capacity. designed to operate at a fraction of a top-tier swordsman's actual ability. The partial capacity was, in this context, still enough to dismantle most of the teams in under 30 seconds. He watched two teams go before his. The first team got one exchange in before both cadets hit the wall. The second lasted 3 exchanges, which was better, and appeared to understand blocking, which was why they lasted longer. His team included a girl named Kira from the Sloth family line who had, during the Aura exam, dealt with the pressure by simply slowing all bodily functions to below conscious level, not resisting but reducing the target. A genuinely inventive response. He explained the plan in 3 sentences while they waited their turn. He would create a darkness void in the clone's immediate space, deploy dimensional daggers within it, and she would mark the position during the initial engagement so he could target without visual reference. She needed to hold contact for approximately 4 seconds. She said that was fine. She said it with the flat calm of the sloth bloodline, which meant she would either do it without hesitation or fall asleep before the contact phase. He had written sloth heirs as capable of either outcome. When their turn came, the clone moved the way the novel's swordmaster moved, with economy rather than flash, the kind of efficient motion that arrives faster than it appears to begin. Kira caught the first exchange on her forearms with a hardened skin ability that turned her outer layer temporarily stone hard. It cost her something to maintain, visible in the effort around her jaw, but she held the contact the 4 seconds he needed. The void opened. He stepped into it, and the courtyard disappeared. Dimensional daggers assembled in the dark. Not thrown, exactly, but released at angles he had memorized from the clone's position before the void came down. 7 releases in rapid succession. He felt 3 of them connect through the feedback on the mana thread. He closed the void. The clone was still upright, but with 7 gashes in configuration that hadn't been there before, and the construct's stabilization matrix was visibly cycling. It moved toward him, and he caught the slight misalignment in the footwork, the detail the eye of Superbia made readable, muscle pressure before weight shift, and moved outside the sword arc by a smaller margin than was comfortable. Kira hit it from behind in the same instant with the full weight of stone-hardened arms. The clone's matrix failed. It stopped moving. In the gallery above, one of the senior instructors asked the colleague beside her when a darkness attribute cadet with chaos secondary had last enrolled at Saitan. The colleague said she had no record of any. The instructor said she thought not. 2 rows over in the gallery, a large man with old scars on both forearms watched the match end and crossed his arms and said nothing and filed something away in the private ledger of a person who has survived enough to know that the things worth watching are the things that don't quite make sense yet. Renee's match came last among the heirs. Her clone operated at full partial capacity. The instructors had noticed the aura endurance display and made an adjustment. She walked into the exam area without a weapon drawn. The clone went for the draw first. She met it with a full release of her own aura at point-blank range. Not an attack, a statement. And the contest between those 2 forces lasted exactly as long as it took the instructors to understand what they were seeing. The clone's structural matrix gave under the pressure differential before the blade cleared the scabbard. She bisected it in one motion after. The gallery did not produce polite applause. It produced the particular human noise people make when they see something that rewrites their expectations mid-occurrence and their bodies react before their manners do. He watched from the waiting area and felt the specific sensation of reading a scene in a book you've written and encountering, for the first time, the realization that the prose had not caught what you were actually trying to describe. He had written Renee as powerful. He had given her abilities and numbers. He had given her scenes. He had not captured, in any line he'd produced, what it looked like to watch her actually fight. He decided not to examine this feeling very closely and went to find the armory. The armory was underground. Stone steps, oil lamps, a smell like old metal and preserved leather. The top 8 went in by order of exam rank. The heirs of the Deadly Sin families first, then Adele last, which meant he arrived to a room that had already been worked through by 7 people with better claim to everything valuable. The headmaster's protocol gave each cadet 1 item, first-come preference. By the time he reached the floor, the obvious choices were gone. 3 blade artifacts with visible marking sigils, a set of gauntlets that had been constructed for a left-handed fighter, 2 defensive items with clear family pedigree. What remained were 12 items without markings. No family crest, no visible construction date, no legible inscription. The ones that looked like prizes but declined to explain themselves. Standard armory protocol provided brief documentation for marked items. Unmarked items received no documentation. He pulled out the information paper. A price appeared before any question. This one was new. Not a weapon, not coins, an artifact of relic grade or above. He did not have a relic grade artifact. He surveyed the remaining 12 items and looked for something that had the quality of being misidentified. Placed here, because whoever cataloged it had not understood what they were handling. The information paper's pricing tracked importance, not market value. It would charge more for the answer to a question that mattered more. He had learned this. He had used it deliberately. He picked up each item in sequence, held it, paid attention. Most of them had the passive mana signature of something inert. Old, possibly authentic, possibly decorative, definitely below relic grade. The 9th item was a necklace. Simple cord, single pendant, the stone a deep gray-green that did not catch the lamplight in any direction. The moment his hand closed around it, something moved at the edge of his status window. Not a notification, not text, just a shift in the display's field, as if the window had turned to look at something. He put the necklace in his pocket and kept moving so as not to create a visual record of having paused. He asked the paper what it was worth. The price came back. One offer to a god. Below a god, legendary artifact. Above legendary, an offer. There was no category above that in the ranking system he'd constructed. He had not written a category above that. Whatever was on the cord around his neck was sitting outside the fiction he'd built to contain it. He kept his face neutral and walked to the exit. Bolton was waiting in the corridor. The heir of the Envy family was not physically imposing in the way a wall is imposing. He was lean, an average height, with quick eyes and a permanent expression of mild delight that had the quality of something painted over a different expression entirely. He had finished third in the exam results, which had visibly irritated him in the way that information irritates someone who expected to be first and finds arithmetic slightly offensive. He extended his right hand. The novelist recognized the gesture and what it actually was from the novel. A handshake as a combat opener. Bolton's particular gift involved kinetic amplification. He could channel force through contact, and a greeting handshake was a legal context in which contact was expected. The Crusher. He'd written it as an early arc intimidation technique. It worked consistently because nobody was ever prepared for it. He took the hand. Position transfer activated at the moment of grip. Not to his own position, but to a swap between the hands themselves. A millimeter of relative shift that was technically within the rules of the ability, and practically meant that Bolton's amplification discharged into his own palm instead of through the point of contact. The heir of Envy blinked. He looked at his hand, he looked at the novelist. His expression cycled through confusion into something that was definitively not confusion. A voice from behind said his name in a tone that carried several meanings at once, most of them in the register of a person who has adopted managerial responsibility over a situation they didn't plan. Renee came to a stop between them. She did not touch either person. She explained, briefly and without inflection, that damage to newly enrolled cadets before the semester started would create an administrative inconvenience that nobody currently present wanted. She said this looking at Bolton. Bolton looked back at her for a moment and then looked at the novelist with the specific expression of someone who has found an entry on a list they intend to return to. He said he'd remember this. He meant it warmly. That was the more unsettling version. Classes started on a Monday. Instructor Idea arrived 14 seconds late to the first session of hunting class, which the novelist had written as a deliberate theatrical choice on her part. She liked to enter a room that had already been waiting. She was the Legion of Calamity's most decorated field commander. The rank meant something specific in demon military history. She had participated in the assault on the human capital, and she had survived it, and she had been responsible for a portion of the strategic outcome that could be measured in a single very large number. She wore her hair loose and her sleeve rolled to the elbow and her expression in the general direction of pleasant. She told the class they would begin practical assessment. She told them to attack her. 3 cadets attempted this. The first was airborne within 1 second and hit the practice room's far wall with enough force to leave a dent the shape of a shoulder. The second activated a family technique that produced a shockwave from both palms and watched Idea step through the pressure differential as if it had texture rather than force. The third produced a weapon and stopped before using it when Idea turned to look at him with an expression that completed the sentence more efficiently than any physical response would have. No one else moved. She was about to ask if they were done when a sound came from directly behind her. She turned. The novelist was standing there. He had crossed the room during the sequence. While everyone watched the 3 failed attempts, while the room's attention tracked the visible action, and placed himself behind the instructor without activating any ability, using nothing except the pattern recognition of someone who knew exactly where the class's collective attention would be focused and exactly how long that focus would last. Idea looked at him for 2 full seconds. She told everyone to sit down. She told the novelist he had passed. In the gallery observation slot above the practice room, a large scarred man watched this through a narrow viewing aperture, with the expression of someone updating a threat assessment. Instructor Ares had been watching the new enrollment cohort since the armory. He had been watching one enrollment in particular. Swordsmanship with Ares operated on the principle that fatigue was the most honest evaluator of technique. The first 3 sessions were entirely physical. No weapons, no drills, no instruction. Running, carrying, repeated movement patterns under load until the pattern either became automatic or the body expressed inability. Ares watched from a stool with the crossed arms posture of a man content to wait for information to surface naturally. On the 4th session, he produced weapons. Fran attempted to have a cadet carry her blade case using a charm application on the cadet's arm, low level, nearly invisible, technically categorized as academic context magic rather than direct coercion. Ares noticed it. He added her name to a separate list and added 3 additional weighted run sessions to the class schedule without explaining the cause, which was worse than direct punishment in several ways. Samuel was found to have substituted a training weight with a hollowed replica at some point during the 2nd week. Ares found this not by inspecting the weights, but by watching Samuel's grip position, which had the specific micro-adjustment of someone managing something lighter than expected. He added Samuel's name to the same list. The novelist did not do either of these things. He did the sessions as assigned and at the speed they were assigned at, and when Ares eventually called him to the front of the class for a demonstration duel, he accepted without manufacturing an excuse. The duel lasted 42 seconds. Ares ended it by placing a sword tip at the novelist's throat from a position that had no readable preceding motion, the kind of move available only to someone who had been fighting at this level for longer than the novelist had been alive. The class watched. Several of them were quiet in the way that produces useful information. Ares told him he had made one correct adjustment during the exchange. He said this as if determining how much information to give a person he had not yet decided warranted information. He dismissed the class and watched the novelist leave. The surveillance sparrow arrived in the novelist's bag 3 days later without explanation. He found it during morning inventory, turning it over in his hands. He had not noticed when it was placed there, which meant Ares was considerably better at close quarters positioning than anyone had given the man credit for, which was itself information worth having. He kept the sparrow. He named it nothing. He gave it mana in the morning, because it seemed to expect this. Magic class with Robolt was the course the novelist had expected to navigate most easily and found most consistently surprising. Robolt was the smallest of the 3 instructors in physical presence and the one who spoke the least, and the gap between these facts and what his ability actually represented was larger than any individual student had correctly estimated on arrival. His suppression field, the ability to render all active mana inert within a defined radius, was not dramatic in expression. It simply made things stop. The experience of having your active ability mid-execution suddenly become nothing was the kind of thing a person remembered in their joints afterward. The attribute test came in the 2nd week. Standard procedure. Each cadet directed mana into a crystal array, which reflected the attribute color and type back through the display matrix. Most reflected cleanly. Blue for ice, red for fire, gold for light. The expected attributes for the expected bloodlines, in expected combination. The novelist directed his mana into the array. 2 colors came back. Darkness, deep charcoal, nearly black, expected for the arson bloodline, and something else underneath it, visible only because the display matrix was sensitive enough to catch secondary attributes. Gray, flat, neutral, not a shade of any other color but definitively present. Not the gray of an undeveloped attribute or an indeterminate reading, a gray that had specific texture. Robolt looked at the display. He looked at it for a longer time than any previous result had required. He said he had no instructional material for the secondary attribute. He said this without visible disturbance, in the manner of someone noting an administrative gap that would require follow-up. He closed the session early. He found the novelist after class and asked him, in the corridor and quietly, whether he had ever met a demon who shared his secondary attribute. The novelist said he hadn't. Robolt nodded as if this confirmed rather than opened something and walked away with the slightly distracted gait of a person whose internal research process has just received new fuel. Samuel escalated the hallway situation on a Thursday, which was the novelist's assessment of the most probable day. Thursdays were between swordsmanship and hunting class, a gap in scheduled structure that created exactly the kind of unmonitored time in which Samuel's particular combination of rage and discipline tended to find outlets. He had seen it building. Samuel had hated him from the enrollment reception and had been managing that hatred with the specific effort of someone who had been told by an authority he respected that direct action was not currently sanctioned. The management was visibly costing something. Samuel walked past him in corridors with a jaw set precisely 3 degrees tighter than baseline. He ate meals at the table farthest from wherever Adele happened to sit. He had not looked directly at him in 2 weeks. The trigger was a word, half-breed, delivered in a hallway with nobody important nearby to observe. The novelist took it without visible reaction, which was its own kind of response, the kind that reads as either extreme control or total contempt, depending on what the observer needs to believe. Samuel moved forward. The mana came up around his hands with the particular signature of the gluttony bloodline, a devouring quality, an intake rather than a projection, the kind of ability that consumes what it contacts rather than striking it. All of the mana in the hallway went inert. Robolt had appeared at the corridor's end and widened his field to cover the full space. He said nothing. He looked at Samuel. He looked at the novelist. He turned and walked in the direction he'd been going. Samuel's expression in the 10 seconds after that, the specific work of a person whose absolute certainty about what they were about to do has been interrupted and is now recategorizing the last 2 minutes, was more information about Samuel than anything the novelist had previously observed. He moved on. He did not tell anyone. He was filing things. Instructor Idea announced the class representative appointment on a Wednesday. The expectation in the room was so thoroughly structured toward a single outcome that it had already stopped being an expectation and had become a fact waiting for verbal confirmation. Fran, heir of lust, first exam rank, family prestige sufficient to fund small wars. She had been managing the room for 2 weeks with the unconscious ease of someone who has never experienced an environment that wasn't arranged around her preferences. Idea pointed at the novelist. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the texture of a room receiving information for which it has no prepared response. Fran's expression went through 3 states in rapid sequence. The third one she kept. He could not determine if it was the one she felt or the one she had chosen. Samuel knocked a chair over on his way out at the end of the session. It might have been an accident. The invisibility class happened on a day with rain on the practice room's skylight. Robolt demonstrated the standard demon invisibility technique, a light-bending application that reduced visual presence to something a careful eye could still catch at close range. He spent 15 minutes on theory. He gave the class 10 minutes to attempt it. The novelist applied it immediately. The standard technique was familiar from the novel. He had written it clearly enough to understand the mechanism from inside the body that was performing it. More importantly, he had the chaos attribute underneath the darkness, and when he threaded both through the standard invisibility structure, the result was something different. Not a reduction in visual presence, an absence. He disappeared from the practice room space entirely. Robolt's head came up from the attendance sheet. He had been tracking the room's mana signatures. One of them had gone fully absent, which was not a thing that the standard technique produced. He looked at where the novelist had been standing. He looked at the rest of the room. He finished taking attendance, asked the class to continue practicing, and walked to the corner where no one appeared to be standing. He said quietly that if the cadet near the window wall was willing to stop by his office after meal period, he would be grateful for the conversation. The novelist reappeared. Several cadets stepped backward with the involuntary speed of people who have just understood that the empty space they'd been mentally treating as available was occupied by something they couldn't see. Robolt's office contained 3 walls of books, a research desk with documents stacked in the careful disorder of an organized mind mid-process, and a tome on the far shelf that the novelist noticed because it was chained at the cover rather than shelved normally. He looked at it. His necklace grew briefly warm. He looked at Robolt instead. They discussed the attribute in practical terms. Robolt said he had been seeking a research subject with unusual mana characteristics, and that the information would be handled with discretion. He offered mana potions and a contract scroll, a demon god contract, binding and unbreakable, formalizing both parties' obligations. The novelist read it. He signed. On his way out, he looked at the tome again. The necklace was warm again, the pendant sitting differently against his chest than it usually did. He did not mention this. He went back to his room and spent the next 2 weeks developing the chaos invisibility on his own time. The results were not consistently comfortable. On the 4th attempt, his hearing disappeared for 2 hours the moment he deactivated. Full silence, no ambient sound, a quality of isolation that had nothing to do with the room's acoustic properties, and everything to do with something the chaos attribute was doing to his sensory existence. On the 7th attempt, he lost taste. On the 10th, touch. He set the current safe limit at 3 seconds. He noted the theoretical ceiling was something he preferred not to reach without understanding what was below him when he fell. Oregon Prison Field Trip. The prison sat in the Demon Realm's southern territory, a human facility remnant, repurposed. Rows of holding cells, processing corridors, and in the exterior fields a practice ground that the class arrived to find pre-populated with prisoners, organized by ability level and flagged with classification markers. This was the practical component of hunting class. Instructor Idea explained, without prolonged preamble, that the objective was to execute. Each cadet required 1 kill to complete the session. She said the word complete as if she were describing paperwork. Most of the class found this manageable. Most of them had spent their entire lives being trained toward this exact act and were executing here for the first time in a supervised setting rather than the first time absolutely. Luna could not do it. He had noticed her in class before this day. The pink-haired girl who sat in the back row and healed minor training injuries with a quiet competence that other half-demons in the class found useful and tried not to appear grateful for. She was half-demon, which meant she had been navigating the same category of ambient hostility he navigated, except she'd been doing it longer and with less political cover. She had never mentioned it. She applied her healing and kept a low profile and watched everything. At the field site, she stood in front of her assigned prisoner and could not do it. The prisoner was not threatening. He was not resisting. He was sitting on the ground and looking at the sky with the expression of someone who has already finished processing his situation. She stood there for 2 minutes and then 4, and then she was visibly failing to perform the action she was required to perform, and 3 other cadets had already finished and were watching, and the window available to her before an instructor intervention started closing. He came to stand behind her. He said nothing audible to anyone watching. He put his hand over hers where she gripped the blade. He told her not to think about what it was. He told her to think about what she could do with what came after. That this was the price of getting to keep working, and the work was healing, and the healing was real, and the list of people she hadn't lost yet was longer than the ones she had, and keeping that list long required staying enrolled. He said it quietly and quickly, and he held the grip until she was holding it, rather than his hand holding hers. It took 3 more seconds. When it was over, she took a very slow breath and handed the blade back without looking at him. He went to the far end of the field and found a way to use his time there that did not require him to think about what he'd just said, or whether he had believed it. The underground section of the facility was accessible through a maintenance corridor. He found it 40 minutes before departure, and went in alone. The corridor widened into a chamber that was older than the prison by a significant margin. The walls here were carved rather than constructed, and the carving had the same script he'd seen on the altar room beneath Kree's mountain, and on the cover of Robolt's chained tome. At the chamber's center, a skeleton sat against the far wall in the specific posture of something that arranged itself deliberately before it stopped. It communicated not through sound but through a transfer. something that moved through the mana connection the cultivation technique had opened, words arriving with the quality of information deposited rather than spoken. It told him the chaos attribute was old, connected to the original arson bloodline, and that the bloodline's connection to the 7 deadly sins families was not coincidental. It told him to be careful with chaos. It told him the attribute consumed the user when misapplied, not as a consequence but as a mechanism, because the chaos attribute at full operation did not make the user more powerful, but made the user less constrained by existence, and existence was a meaningful constraint. It was warning him about what he had already partially discovered during the invisibility training. Before the connection closed, a new trait appeared in his status window. Telekinesis, limited, new, enough to levitate a single dagger for approximately 4 seconds. He practiced it on the walk back to the prisoner transport. By the time the class boarded the return vehicle, he could hold the dagger for 6 seconds. He considered this progress and kept his expression appropriately baseline. The spy sat 2 rows ahead of him on the transport. He'd been watching Kyle since the 2nd week of classes. Kyle had presented as a half-demon with a minor Earth family background, below-average mana reserves, and the social posture of someone comfortable with irrelevance. He sat where unimportant people sit. He ate when convenient. He participated when required and no more. He was performing average with a thoroughness that only becomes visible when you know what thorough average performance is trying to conceal. The novelist knew because he had written Kyle. Not in detail, a minor character, positioned in the story as a mechanism rather than a person. A human spy embedded in Saitan, motivated by one thing, his sister Rei, who had a mana overflow condition that would kill her within 18 months without intervention. On the transport back from Oregon, Kyle was watching the fields outside the window with an expression that had too much stillness in it for the context. The other cadets were processing the day. Tired, quiet. The specific flatness that follows required violence. Kyle was watching the fields the way someone watches terrain they are mentally mapping. He caught the novelist looking at him, and the stillness sharpened briefly before going neutral again. He had made a correction. He knew. The novelist looked back at his hands. The telekinesis kept the dagger floating for 8 seconds now. He watched it, giving Kyle's attention a place to land that was not his face. The confrontation happened 2 days later, in the practice room's storage section after class. The novelist got there first. He had a general sense of the timing from knowing the story's architecture. The spy subplot in the novel had moved on a specific internal logic, and that logic was still running here even with its author standing inside it. Kyle came in looking for him. That was the version the novelist had arranged. The fight was direct and not comfortable. Kyle was a trained operative, not a cadet. His movement had the texture of applied violence rather than academic violence. He was faster than his presented mana level suggested, and smarter about positioning than most heirs at the school, who were used to winning on raw power margin. The novelist took 2 solid hits, used position transfer to change the engagement's geometry twice, deployed killing intent at the point where Kyle's composure started showing the first available crack, and held the advantage long enough to pin the man against the storage shelves with a blade at the shoulder and the specific aura of someone willing to finish the conversation. Kyle was breathing hard. He was not surrendering. The novelist told him about Rei, the mana overflow condition, the 18-month timeline. He recited the details the way a person reads coordinates, not the way a person delivers news. Kyle went still. The novelist produced the twin goo poison, a compound that split into paired quantities and, once divided, each half responded to the other's stimulation. He explained the arrangement. 1 portion would go inside the novelist, 1 portion would be delivered to Rei's body. The portion in Rei's body would interact with her mana overflow, the same general mechanism as a stabilizer, applied through indirect contact, reducing the lethal accumulation rate. As long as the novelist remained alive and unharmed, the portion in Rei would continue stabilizing her condition. The symmetry of the arrangement was also its binding force. Kyle understood the structure immediately. He was a spy. He understood leverage geometry by professional habit. He asked how long. The novelist said as long as necessary. He said it the way someone describes a natural fact. The contract scroll went on the floor between them. Kyle signed it. The demon god contract made the terms unbreakable in both directions, which meant the novelist was also committed, which was a detail Kyle would have noted if he were operating at full analytical capacity, which he was not, because he was a person who had just been told his dying sister could live. The novelist told him his first assignment: send false intelligence to the Imperial Academy. Report that Saitan's first-year class was preparing a target operation against the third-year dormitory. Keep all other communications minimal and delay-heavy. Kyle left. He came back to class the next day and was gone from enrollment by the end of the week. Officially, a withdrawal for health reasons. In practice, he was outside the academy's walls, doing the only work the novelist needed from him. Robolt's underground lab was accessible through a door behind the bookshelf that the novelist had identified on his second visit and not mentioned until it was relevant. The staircase descended 2 full floors below the office level, which put it below the academy's standard monitoring infrastructure. The room at the bottom was large and organized in the manner of someone whose research had outgrown its original space several times over and been reorganized each time without discarding anything from previous iterations. 3 workbenches, 24 contained samples behind glass. At the far wall, on its own table, the chained tome. Robolt unlocked the chain with a key he kept on his person. He opened the cover and placed it flat under the lamp. The script inside was the same he had seen in the altar room, in the Oregon underground chamber, on the outer face of the necklace's pendant. The same age, the same hand, or something that worked like a hand. When the novelist touched the page, his necklace moved. Not physically, but in the mana sense, the same warmth as before but with more direction to it now, pulled toward the text as if the 2 things were in conversation across a difference of centuries. The script resolved for approximately 40 seconds. He read during those 40 seconds as fast as his eyes could move. The text described the first Demon King, not as mythology but as a person, specific, with particular habits and particular fears, the kind of detail that mythology removes because mythology is interested in meaning rather than fact. The first Demon King had created the chaos attribute as a research outcome rather than a natural occurrence, which contradicted everything the demon world's academic literature said about it. Created it to solve a specific problem. The problem was not named on the page the necklace could reach. The text went dark again. His necklace cooled. Robolt watched him and said nothing. He told Robolt that the script described historical accounts related to the first Demon King's research period, and that he would need additional contact sessions to work through the full document. Robolt agreed to this and produced 3 mana potions from the corner cabinet and the contract scroll, already written, which confirmed the demon god contract was binding in both directions. He signed it. He pocketed the potions. He looked at the necklace lying against his chest and decided it had chosen a good time to become interesting. On the way back up the stairs, Robolt mentioned, without turning around, that the script had been unreadable for 11 years. He said this without elaborating. The novelist did not elaborate either. They arrived at the office and went their separate directions with the careful courtesy of 2 people who have just entered an arrangement that neither can fully afford to break. The class monitors meeting was the week before midterms. All 7 class representatives gathered in a small administrative room with a presentation stand at the front and a roster board on the right wall that broke each class's performance metrics into a grid. The monitors from classes B through G arrived with the comfortable posture of people attending a procedural event. The Class D representative arrived with the specific energy of someone who had prepared a position. His name was Hale. He had a thick build and the habit of touching his own collar when he was deciding whether to say a thing. He touched his collar twice, looking at the novelist, which meant he had decided to say the thing before he arrived. He said that the Class A representative's enrollment status had irregularities that the faculty review process had not fully resolved, and that his presence in this meeting constituted a procedural question that the assembled monitors should formally address. The novelist placed a dagger on the table between them. He did not produce it dramatically. He set it down the way a person sets down a cup. He said the procedural question was now resolved if Hale preferred to continue, or resolved by default if he preferred not to. Hale looked at the dagger and touched his collar once more and sat down. The meeting covered midterm logistics. The headmaster's assignment, relayed through the class monitors, specified that Class A's midterm target would be human cadets conducting field training outside the Imperial Academy's main barrier. Outdoor domain, unfamiliar terrain, and the target class would have defensive support from their own instructors. The novelist absorbed all of this and asked 2 clarifying questions about the gate schedule. He thanked the room for its time and left. Instructor Aries, who had attended as faculty observer, watched him leave. He wrote something in his notes and underlined it. The midterm operation began through a dimensional gate at the northern end of Saitan's training wing. 21 cadets in formation, a 3-hour transit through the gate network, and emergence into human realm air that had a different quality from what his lungs had been processing for weeks. Colder, drier, the smell of pine needles and altitude. The domain entrance was 3 kilometers through forest that the Scout Sparrow had partially mapped in the preceding 72 hours. He had briefed the class in 2 sessions. He had kept the briefing to what they needed rather than what he knew, because what he knew was considerably more than he could explain without introducing questions he couldn't answer. He knew the domain's interior layout in rough terms. He knew where the human instructor Besaha stationed himself. He knew that the student cadets inside were first years, and that their support from the 5th Circle Mage would be decisive if they reached him before the mage was removed from the equation. The class entered the domain in 3 subgroups. He took the first group himself and moved them toward the instructor's position, leaving the other 2 groups with senior cadets from Samuel's and Fran's cohort. Fran's charm magic made her group the most stable defensive unit. Samuel's destructive capacity made his group the most aggressive offensive option. He had assigned accordingly. Besaha's underground chamber was accessed through a side passage 40 meters from the domain's central hall. The mage was working when the novelist found him, which told him the false intelligence from Kyle had landed correctly. No defensive posture, no assembled response team, no alert status. A 5th Circle Mage at rest in familiar territory. 6 layered barrier shields covering his body in overlapping fields, which was not rest in any sense the word usually implied, but was the standard operating posture for a human mage of that rank who wasn't actively expecting a fight. He could not hit through 6 layered shields in sequence. The barriers were designed to absorb and redistribute impact. He needed to remove the space the barriers were protecting. He opened the darkness void. The chamber went absolute. The mage's barriers were visible inside the void as geometric shapes, pale outlines, because they were mana constructs, and darkness stripped light but not mana signatures. He moved around the perimeter, releasing dimensional daggers not at the man but at the barrier anchors, the corner points where each shield layer locked into the mana architecture. He found them by the shape of the light they didn't have. 3 anchors on the first barrier, 4 on the second. He worked through them methodically. The mage was firing countermeasures into the darkness with the controlled speed of a professional who trains for zero visibility scenarios, and 2 of them came close enough that he had to abandon his second anchor line mid-sequence and reset his position. It took 9 minutes. The shields dropped in sequence from the outside in. When the 6th one went, Besaha was out of pre-prepared defenses and reaching for secondary components. The dimensional daggers came from 3 different angles in the half-second before he completed the secondary casting. The novelist closed the void. Besaha was on the floor. His mana signature had stopped. The room was very quiet. He stood still for a moment. The cost of the extended void application sat across his chest like a slab of stone. His mana reserves were below the comfortable operational threshold. He had known they would be. He had planned for what was available at the other side of this expenditure and found the answer in Besaha's storage cabinet, which his author knowledge told him would be there. The elixir was in a sealed vial in the cabinet's locked lower section. He opened it with position transfer applied to the lock mechanism. He drank it standing up, because sitting down felt like a concession. What happened to his mana was not incremental. The darkness attribute took the elixir's energy and converted it without asking, spreading through his reserves and pushing the count past 2,000. The change arrived in the body as heat, and then as the specific awareness of space that comes when something that was previously constrained is no longer. He had written this upgrade into the story. He had not anticipated the physical sensation of it. Upstairs, the battle was ongoing. He found the main hall mid-exchange. His class was holding on the organized defense Fran's buffs were maintaining, but Fias had already done damage that could not be undone. Samuel was down on the right side of the hall with injuries that did not permit him to stand, which told him the fight had gone somewhere specific before he arrived. Leon Fias stood near the hall's center with an ice hammer the size of a large man's torso and the expression of someone running a practice procedure rather than responding to a situation. Student Council, Imperial Academy. The protagonist's father had been connected to this bloodline by close bond in the original novel. That background had not made Fias less dangerous. If anything, the family legacy operated as a floor rather than a ceiling for his capabilities. He had already cut Sylvia off before the novelist arrived. He heard about this afterward, from the cadets who had watched it. She had tried to negotiate a withdrawal arrangement. He had ended the conversation in one motion, mid-sentence, without apparent consideration of the moral weight of what he was doing. The cadets who described it did not embellish it. They didn't need to. He engaged Fias directly. The ice hammer produced force that wasn't entirely physical. Each swing carried a cold pressure wave that arrived before the contact point, softening the target's physical resistance at the molecular level before the impact registered. The novelist got behind a position transfer twice, and inside the swing radius once, which worked until Fias adjusted his swing arc. The third exchange put him against the wall with a cracked left side and the specific quality of breathing that means something is displaced rather than broken, but will feel identical until a healer determines the difference. He was also running a timer. The snake worm in his pocket had been dormant since Oregon. He had fed it mana consistently since its evolution there, and watched it grow into something considerably more mobile than the pale thing Kree had originally installed. During the second exchange, while Fias was repositioning, he maneuvered the creature to the opponent's shoulder through a position transfer applied to the coat rather than the body. The worm moved into place and bit and returned. Fias did not react. The bite was invisible. The worm's effect was not immediate. He needed 30 more seconds. The information paper had told him, at a cost he'd been unwilling to detail specifically, that the original Adele's power could be borrowed temporarily. 20%, available for 1 hour, accessible through the paper's mechanism. The cost was unspecified. The paper had displayed a single line in place of a price. It would take something the novelist valued. It had not named what. He had agreed. There had not been a better option available when he'd agreed, and arriving at the Fias fight with his mana already drained from Besaha's chamber meant there was no better option now either. 20% of the original Adele's power entered him through the paper, and his mana count went to 4,300, and the darkness came up without deliberate activation, spreading from his position in a wave that covered the hall's back third and turned the space cold, in a different way than Fias's ice did. He fought Fias inside it. The eye of Superbia slowed the perceived moment of each swing to something navigable. He moved faster than he had been moving and took 2 more hits and delivered 6, and when the hour's end began registering as a drop in the mana counter, he used the remaining reserves to push Fias back to the hall's edge and hold position. Fias produced a return scroll. He pressed it. He was gone. The hall was quiet. He remained upright through concentration rather than structural integrity. His left side reported problems he was not currently in a position to address. Samuel had been watching from the floor. What remained of Samuel's right arm and the ruins of his left leg had told him everything necessary about his own timeline without requiring a medical opinion. He was losing the quantities of blood that end things, and he knew it. He looked at the novelist and said something. The novelist moved to him and listened. What Samuel proposed had no parallel in anything the author had prepared for. He said he could transform, shift his biology into a form that required no blood, no organ function, none of the systems that were currently failing. The horn form. Fused to a living host's hand, sustained by that host's mana. Dormant, rebuilding slowly over months, drawing on the connection for survival. He said the host would have to be the novelist. He said this with the flat directness of someone who has removed everything except the operative fact from the sentence. Not asking, stating. There was no other option that ended in Samuel existing past the next 20 minutes, and Samuel had decided he wanted to exist past the next 20 minutes. The novelist held out his left hand. The transformation was not gradual. Samuel compressed, changed state, and the horn emerged from the novelist's knuckles with the specific wrongness of something that had no reference point in previous experience. It was attached. It was present in the sensory field the way a limb is present. It was also very clearly a horn, which was going to require explanation in any number of upcoming contexts. He looked at it for a moment. He said nothing and stood up and went to find Luna. Besaha's underground lab held them for one night. Luna healed what she could reach and stabilized what she could not fully resolve, working through the cases in order of severity, with the methodical focus of someone who has converted fear into procedure. The novelist sat against the wall while she worked and counted the class. 17 remaining of 21 who had entered the domain. 4 empty spaces in the attendance that would produce permanent administrative records. Luna finished the last case and sat down on the floor across from him and said she was afraid of losing him specifically. She said it directly, without building to it, the way people say true things when the surrounding circumstances have removed the buffer of social indirection. He told her what she already partially understood, that her healing ability was going to determine how many people around her survived the next several years. He told her the fear of loss was real and was not going away, and that the most productive use of it was to make her better at the work, because the work was the thing that reduced the number of times the fear was justified. He said it without flinching from the math of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they've accepted something they didn't want but understand is correct. He woke up the next morning to the sound of impact 300 meters away. Cecilia had been tracking them since the domain exit. The archer from the Imperial Academy's Student Council operated at 5 kilometers distance, which was a range at which normal counter-engagement options ran out of available geometry. Her first volley hit the tree line 40 meters to their right and removed 3 mature trees at the trunk. The shockwave reached them a half-second later. He assessed the situation in the time it took Samuel to comment from his hand that this was a terrible plan that would end badly. He agreed it was a terrible plan. The arrow's mana signature was readable even at distance. He had the sparrow in his bag. He told Fran to apply every buff in her available stack to Samuel's remaining operational capacity, and he told Samuel what he needed. Samuel produced a devouring tornado from his horn form. The ability translated through the connection differently than it would have from a whole body, but the core mechanism was intact. Intake, rotation, vacuum force. He fed darkness into the base of the rotation, and the combined output was not a counter to the arrow so much as a localized environment that the arrow had to travel through, and arrows that size traveling through darkness-infused vacuum got their trajectory altered by the mana density differential before they reached the class's position. The second volley deflected. 2 cadets took minor fragment damage. Everyone else made the tree line. The dimensional gate required a point of contact on the interior surface. He had a sword from a cadet who had entered the gate network at the mission's start, left inside as part of the original entry formation, still technically present on the gate's inner frame by the mechanics of how spatial anchoring worked with position transfer's current level. He had planned for this. He had planned for most of it. The parts he hadn't planned for were currently fused to his left hand. He swapped to the sword. He was through the gate. He reached back with the mana thread and swapped the next cadet through, and the next, running the chain at the maximum speed position transfer allowed. 17 people, himself and 1 horn. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. The gate closed. He sat down on Saitan's stone floor and did not get up for a while. The infirmary at Saitan smelled of blood and burning herbs. This is where the story had started its telling, and here is where the story had arrived. He lay in the cot with magecloth bandaging, and the particular quality of consciousness that follows significant mana debt combined with structural injury. His mana pool had bottomed out during the gate sequence. The borrowed 20% had taken something on its way out, as promised, and he had not yet determined what. He felt the absence of it the way you feel a word you know but cannot access. Somewhere in his mental architecture, a door was closed. Luna sat beside him for 3 hours before he opened his eyes. When he did, she had already placed her hands over the worst of the structural damage on his left side, and the healing was running before he finished orienting to the room. He said her name. She said she had been waiting. She said it without inflection, stating a fact. He told her she had passed the class. She said she knew. Outside, the midterm results were posted. Fran had taken first place, which she received with the expression of someone who has always known the answer and finds it privately satisfying to have it confirmed in writing. Balton had taken second and asked 3 different cadets whether Adele had seen the posting before concluding that the ranking was incomplete data and he would need more information to reach a useful conclusion. Diana had placed 3rd from a position that continued to make no sense to anyone who understood her actual capacity. He placed 4th. Renee placed 5th. Luna placed 38th and received a scholarship that cleared her enrollment cost for the following year. The doctor who ran the infirmary came to speak with her, while the novelist was still in the cot. He told her he had been watching her work since the cadets came back from the mission. He told her the school had a formal medical training track and that she was the first cadet in his 12 years at Saitan whom he had considered genuinely suited for it. Luna looked at the novelist when she heard this. He looked back and said nothing and let her make the decision from an uncrowded room. She told the doctor she was interested. The instructor review happened the day after the results were posted. He heard about it afterward from Fran, who heard about it from someone with access to the observation record, which existed because all class missions were monitored and documented through the Sparrow network. The faculty watched the full mission footage. They saw Basaha's chamber, they saw the hall engagement, they saw the gate sequence. Instructor Ares, who had spent the semester with a surveillance sparrow in the novelist's bag and a working theory that the Class A representative was an embedded human agent, watched the footage through to the end. The footage showed, in sequence, a cadet who had operated without contact with any human authority structure, exposed and captured a genuine spy who was feeding false intelligence to the Imperial Academy, organized the class defense under live combat, killed a Fifth Circle mage alone in extended engagement, sustained near-fatal injuries while extracting injured cadets from a losing position, and engineered an escape through a closed gate using a method nobody in the faculty had seen before. Ares left the review room, walked to the infirmary, and stood at the door. The novelist was awake by then. The large instructor with old battle scars on both forearms, and the working theory he'd now had to retire entirely extended his right hand across the cot. He said nothing. He kept his arm extended and waited. The novelist looked at it. He looked at the instructor. He shook the hand. Ares withdrew and left without additional comment. The sparrow was still in the bag by the cot. He picked it up and gave it mana, and it sat on his finger and blinked at him with the blank contentment of a creature whose only requirement is that the mana supply continues. He kept it. Recovery ran 5 days. On the 3rd day, Samuel began complaining from his hand. This was medically significant. It meant the horn was rebuilding its communication capacity faster than the doctor had estimated. It was also logistically complicated because the horn had opinions about the food they were receiving and expressed these opinions at volume. Renee visited once each day. She did not stay long. She sat in the chair beside the cot and did not ask questions about his condition, which she had apparently already reviewed through the doctor's notes, and instead spoke about practical matters. The Sparrow's familiar registration deadline, the upcoming vault access schedule, what Fran had said to Baltan at the results posting that had nearly produced a faculty incident. He listened and responded and found the information paper warm in his pocket, the way it got warm when something nearby carried unusual mana. He ignored this on the first visit. On the second visit, he noticed Renee was wearing the ring on her right hand again, which was where she consistently wore it. The paper's warmth had a directional quality he hadn't previously registered. He thought about this for a significant portion of the 3rd day and arrived at no comfortable conclusion. On the 5th day, the doctor cleared him for light movement. On the 6th, he attended the General Assembly, where the headmaster posted vault access order for the 2nd secret chamber opening. She announced the order with the particular flatness of someone reading coordinates. His name was first. She said, still flat, that the previous vault's entry order had disadvantaged certain cadets through no procedural fault of their own, and that the correction was administrative rather than preferential. She looked at the room. Her attention passed over him without stopping, which was its own communication. He received the entry authorization card and held it. The 2nd vault sat in the lower wing of Saitan's oldest building, sealed behind a door that required faculty key and headmaster override simultaneously to access. The entry window opened at noon the following day. He had 1 day to prepare what he was going to ask the information paper, because the vault's unmarked items would require the paper's assessment, and the paper required payment, and he needed to determine in advance what payments were available. His target was specific. The original Adele's personal mana cultivation technique had a cost assigned by the paper in a previous inquiry. 1 legendary artifact, or 10,000 gold coins. He had neither. He had the mana potions from Robolt. He had the Sparrow, now registered as a familiar and therefore categorized differently than an artifact. He had the necklace, which the paper had assessed at 1 offer to a god, placing it beyond the legendary category entirely, which meant it was theoretically the most valuable object in his possession, and also the one he could least afford to use as a payment. He thought about what else he had. He thought about the door that had closed after the borrowed power left him, the thing the original Adele had taken. He still hadn't identified what it was. He could feel its absence but not its former presence, which was the precise problem with things taken cleanly. He went through his catalog of memories and skills and abilities and found everything present except the one he couldn't name because it was gone. He looked at the information paper. He wrote, "What did you take?" The paper stayed blank for longer than usual. Then a single line appeared. It said the answer to that question would be available inside the vault. He sat with that for a long time in the infirmary's thinning afternoon light, the sparrow on his hand and the horn quiet on his knuckle, and outside the window, the demon capital, doing the indifferent business of a city that had been here longer than most of the problems currently inside it. Somewhere in the Academy's lower wing, a door was waiting with his name on the authorization card. He had written the vault into the novel. He had given it contents without specifying all of them, leaving gaps in his own source material, in the way authors leave gaps when a detail isn't needed for the plot they're currently running. The gaps were his now to enter. Whatever waited behind that door was something he had built the room for without finishing the room, and he would find out tomorrow what his own imagination had left inside it. He folded the paper carefully and put it back in his coat. The sparrow moved to his shoulder and settled. He closed his eyes.